South of Saigon, the land runs out of height. The Mekong comes down through Cambodia and spreads across the last 200 miles of Vietnam in a flat plain of its own making, and there is nothing on that plain to stand on. No ridge, no crest, no hill worth a number on a map. A man standing in a rice field could see for miles and see almost nothing, because everything there is the same distance above the water, which is to say almost none. What the Delta has instead is 3,000 nautical miles of rivers, canals, and smaller streams laced through a country of rice and mud, where about half the population of South Vietnam lived. Twice a day the tide comes up out of the South China Sea, runs inland, and turns the current backwards. The men who planned operations there could not say with any confidence how long it would take a boat to get from one place to another. For 5 years, the United States Navy fought a war on that water, and the men who fought it called themselves the Brown Water Navy. There was no ground to take and none to hold. There were only routes, the ones that had to stay open, and the ones that had to be closed. And the work of a route is never finished. This is the complete story of the river war in the Mekong Delta. Before we settle in for the night, if long, quiet history like this helps you rest, a like or a subscription helps. The Long Watch reach other people who fall asleep to the past. An episode like this one takes weeks of reading and assembling, and that one small tap genuinely keeps the watch going. Now get comfortable. There is no hurry in any of this, and nothing in the next 2 hours needs to be remembered. We are going to start where the cruise had to start, with the country itself, the water, the mud it carries, and the tide that decides when anything can move. A paddy dike is high ground here. So is the raised bank of a canal, and so is the earth a house stands on. And that is the whole of the list. The Mekong Delta is a flat alluvial plain, built out of the silt the river carried down and let go of, and it covers about 40,000 square kilometers, close to a quarter of South Vietnam. Roughly half the population of South Vietnam lived down there. The society was agricultural almost without exception, and the Delta grew more than 80% of the country's rice. Most of the surface is paddy, and it is some of the most productive rice ground in the world. Fields, water, people, and very little else standing above any of it. 200 to the square kilometer, near enough, which is about the density of Massachusetts. People lived close to the water because everything moved on it, and where they lived they planted fruit trees, shade trees, bushes put in because somebody liked them. So a settlement and a stand of trees are the same place here. The pattern changes within a few kilometers, from trees in clumps around scattered houses to solid lines of them along every stream. 3,000 nautical miles of it were navigable. 2 large rivers, the Mekong itself and the Bassac, with canals and smaller streams branching off them and joining back into them. For a farmer, none of this was scenery. It was the efficient way to get a crop to market, and it was the reason a region with almost no roads worked at all. What a road was elsewhere, a canal was here. The waterways were not all natural. There is evidence that the people living here had begun improving the natural drainage by the 8th century, and the generations after them went on with the work, so that by the 20th century, thousands of kilometers of dug channel ran beside the streams the river itself had made. That work is older than any of the wars that were later fought across it. A third of the delta is swamp, forest, or flooded forest. The rest is field and channel, and relatively few points in the whole region lie further than a few hundred meters from a navigable waterway. Even the marshes and the woods can be reached by boat. On this ground, water is not the obstacle between places. It is the way between them. The sea reaches a long way inland. Tidal fluctuations run up to about 4 meters, and twice a day the flow turns over, and the current runs the other way, at times as fast as 6 knots. Because the channels connect to one another in so many ways, the tidal effect is exceptionally difficult to predict, and the same reversal arrives at different hours of the day in 2 channels lying a few kilometers apart. That was true in different degrees in different water. The tidal cycle of the big rivers was well understood, and men who worked them could reason about it. About what the tide did in the small streams and the back channels, a great deal less was known, and it was learned one channel at a time by people who had gone up them. The big river comes down in several branches and reaches the sea through several mouths. The towns sit where the branches are. My Tho and Long Shuyen on the Bassac, My Tho upstream on its own arm of the Mekong. A town in the delta is a place where a road, if there is a road at all, comes down and meets water that goes somewhere. In the north of the delta lies the plain of reeds, a flat grassy basin with almost no trees on it. In the wet season it stands under 2 or 3 meters of water. In the dry season it dries out so completely that large grass fires are common across it. It is the same ground both times. The dry season runs from November to March, and the wet from May to October. Movement off the roads is best when the paddies harden enough to carry light-tracked vehicles and guns, and worst when the fields are under water. Even at its best it is limited, every day of the year, by the rivers, the canals, the streams, and the drainage ditches cut between the fields. Along the seaward edges the delta turns to mangrove. There are extensive mangrove swamps, among them the Rung Sat southeast of Saigon, and the U Minh forest over on the western coast. The vegetation on the tidal mudflats is dense, the root structure high and tangled, the canopy closed above it. A boat can go into that. A man on foot goes into it slowly and pays for every meter. There was one hard-surfaced highway for the entire delta. Route 4 ran south out of Saigon to Cambodian, with most of the larger towns strung along it. The secondary roads had gone bad by the middle of the 60s, from lack of repair and from the war, and what network there was counted as of limited use for military operations. The bridges, where there were bridges, carried 10 to 20 tons. From the air the country looks generous. Landing sites are everywhere, and the weather rarely stopped helicopters for long. The generosity ends at the moment of landing. Troops on the ground walk 50 meters and meet a ditch, then a stream, then a canal, and then another canal, and the distance measured across a map stops meaning very much. Channels carried obstructions of their own. In the smaller streams there were fish traps, set where they worked best and left there, narrowing the passage for anything coming through. Some channels had been blocked deliberately. Others had gone shallow and overgrown after years without maintenance, so that a route drawn on a chart was not always a route in front of the bow. The water is brown because the country is. The delta is silt the Mekong brought down and dropped, and the bottom of a channel and the ground a house stands on are the same material at different depths. After the monsoon, the rivers run high and dirty and carry branches and rubbish down with them, and the same mud that fouls an engine intake is the mud that grows the rice. Wet feet were a standing condition rather than an event. The humidity stayed high. Half the year the fields were under water, and anyone crossing this country put his boots in a ditch every few hundred meters. Heat and damp were part of what movement cost here, counted alongside distance and daylight, and counted by everyone who worked here. What you see from a boat is a low green wall. Nipa palm stands half drowned along the waterline, and behind it the bank is not always readable. A buffalo shows above an embankment. A line of palms marks a raised path somebody built. Beyond that, the country goes on flat until it simply stops being visible. And there is nowhere to go to see more of it. There is nothing here to take and hold, nothing that gives a view of the rest and can be sat on afterwards, nothing a company could be told to hold until it was relieved. A boat passes through a place, and the place closes behind it. And the water it went up at 9 in the morning is running the other way by the middle of the afternoon. American servicemen first came into the Mekong Delta in 1957. They came as Navy advisors, taking over from French advisors who were leaving. The work was the same work, on the same rivers. What they were joining was not a beginning. It was the middle of something that had gone on across this water since the end of the Second World War. The French had come out of that war without a river force and assembled one from whatever was to hand. Local craft and boats the Japanese had left behind were plated with armor and given guns. The British handed over a few landing ships and craft. The Army raised flotillas for moving troops and patrolling, and by 1946 the Navy had its own. In 1947 those flotillas were given a name: Naval Assault Divisions, which the French shortened to Dinosaur, and that is the word that stuck to them. The original task was carrying troops with an escort that could shoot. What one division consisted of differed from the next. Depending on the stretch of country it worked. Most of what the French learned about rivers, they learned in the north, in a different delta, on rivers that have nothing to do with the Mekong. The tempo rose steadily from 1946 to the end of the war in 1954. By that last year, the river forces were fully committed and taking heavy losses. One part of the experience carried across without translation. The French were attacked at their moorings, and they took precautions accordingly. Nets set with the rise and fall of the tide to catch drifting mines. Patrol boats out through the night. Grenades dropped into the water at irregular intervals, and at anything floating that could not be identified. Lights burning at the anchorage entrances. It was not enough. Harassing mortar and artillery fire made them move forces they would otherwise have left in place, and shift anchorages after dark to get out from under registered fire. French reports covering the whole campaign, from 1945 through 1954, show that losses from attack while boats lay at anchor exceeded those suffered by convoys underway. It was the plainest lesson they left on this water. The Vietnamese Navy inherited the rivers along with everything else. In 1959, it kept 96 boats and craft on them, gathered into 5 river assault groups, and the headquarters of the river force had just moved from Saigon down into the Delta to My Tho. Each group could put a battalion into the field and keep it supplied for as long as 14 days. The rhythm was a month on and a month off. A month of operations, then a month ashore. Most of it spent taking the boats apart and putting them back together. A training group came down from Saigon with lectures for whatever time was left. Boats working that water wore out on a schedule, and the schedule was built into the year. A group ran about 19 boats, nearly all of them American landing craft from the Second World War, rebuilt for a job their designers had not imagined. On the command boat, the bow ramp had been cut away and replaced with a sharp steel stem. Exactly one type had been designed for a river to begin with. The STCAN, left over from the French period. So the one purpose-built river boat this Navy had was a French boat. It had been drawn for these conditions by people who had worked in them. It went on running long after they had gone home. And it was the only thing on this water that crossed from one war into the next without being converted from something else. The force was short of people for all of those years. In October of 1961, advisors reported it still 30% under strength, and men were being moved from other parts of the Navy to fill the gaps. They were never entirely closed, and boats went out with fewer hands than the work asked for. From October of 1960, the river force picked up a second job. Charcoal from the far south and rice from the Delta provinces had to reach Saigon, and the routes were cut often enough that the city could be separated from both. An escort group was formed for that traffic, and the Navy began convoying commercial craft to the capital. In 1961, there were 27 joint Army and Navy actions in the Delta, and the Navy helped move over 1 million tons of cargo out of it. Convoys were fired on several times that year, and mines went off under them in 5. No cargo vessel was seriously damaged. The work was escorting, and escorting is measured by what does not happen. The other half of this Navy was made of junks. In 1956, an officer named Ho Tan Quyen, commanding the coastal district at Da Nang, bought 10 of them to patrol the 17th parallel. When he was posted to Saigon, the detachment came apart. 2 years later, he talked the president into a national junk force, and it was handed to the Navy. Little came of it, and the man who had pushed for it said so himself afterwards. The Navy had no resources to support a force of that size. It did not understand the fishermen who actually sailed junks, and it had no clear picture of what the force was for. The junks themselves were built in a way that did not stand up to open water. In February of 1962, the decision was taken to grow that fleet from 80 boats to more than 600 in 28 divisions, paid for out of American military aid. Contracts went to yards in the south and to the naval yard at Saigon. Deliveries slipped. Several of the firms worked badly, and a number of the boats in that order were never built. 3 kinds were built. Sailing junks, junks with a motor and a sail together, and motor junks. The command boats were modeled on the fishing junks that worked the mouths of the Mekong. By the end of 1963, nearly all of them were suffering from the wood drying out. In places, the planking had opened by 3 inches. The men were harder to come by than the boats. The fishermen the plan counted on were relatively well off and had no reason to take low-paid service. Desertion was a serious problem. Junks sailed short-handed. Some sat at their moorings, and the training course was cut from 3 months. Over 700 did go through training with the basic course at Cam Ranh Bay, on an old and run-down French base. By 1966, the Delta's naval zone held 6 river assault groups and 11 coastal groups. The assault groups between them could lift 6 infantry battalions. In that year, they were used for the work they had been built for about 10% of the time. Division commanders preferred to move by helicopter. The boats spent their days carrying small provincial units or escorting commercial craft. By then, the American advisory structure ran through the whole Vietnamese military. Close to 700 officers and more than 2,000 enlisted men. What those advisors were looking at was a river force that had been at this since before any of them arrived. The same water, boats a generation old, and crews it had never once been able to fill. Whatever the Americans decided to do here, they would not be starting anything. They would be taking a turn at something already long underway. On the morning of the 16th of February, 1965, an American Army helicopter pilot was flying up the coast of central Vietnam on a medical errand out of Quy Nhon. 600 miles north of the Mekong Delta, coming around a headland called Cap Varela, he banked over a small bay named Vung Ro and looked down at a wooded islet. The islet moved. The foliage on it shifted slightly and wrongly, and he understood that he was not looking at an island at all, but at a ship under cut branches. He marked the place on his map, finished the task he had been sent out to do, and only then telephoned the senior naval advisor for that part of the country. The ship was a 130-foot trawler. It had come in at 3 that morning and spent the day alongside a jetty sheltered by rock, unloading, meaning to finish after dark. That afternoon, an airstrike rolled it onto its side. Taking the ground around the bay took 4 more days. And in the middle of them, the enemy blew the hull in two with a charge of his own. What came out of the water and the caves along that shore included 1 million rounds of small arms ammunition and more than 3,000 small arms, along with signs that large deliveries had been made into the same bay before. None of this happened in the Delta. It happened in Phu Yen province, in the middle of the country, and it changed the way the entire coast was watched. Westmoreland called a meeting in Saigon and asked for a plan, a joint American and Vietnamese barrier along the whole shoreline. The details were worked out in March. The operation was given a name, Market Time, after the local boats that went out along the waterways to fish and to market. It was named, in other words, for the very craft it was going to stop. The coast it had to cover ran 1,200 miles, from the 17th parallel down to the Cambodian border. Along it, by the Coast Guard's own reckoning that spring, there were upward of 60,000 junks and sampans to account for. In 1965, none of it was held in a settled way. South of Vung Tau, the enemy had the use of some 300 miles out of 400. In the middle of April, the Secretary of the Navy asked the Secretary of the Treasury for help. In peacetime, the Coast Guard belonged to the Treasury and had to be asked for rather than ordered. On the 29th of April, the President sent it to Vietnam under naval control, and the order to deploy went out on the 6th of May. 12 days after that order, 17 cutters were sitting on the decks of merchant ships in 7 ports, from New York and Norfolk around to San Francisco and Seattle. Their crews trained in California, damage control, navigation, the rules of the road, the procedures for boarding, and joined their boats at Subic Bay. On the 21st of July, 5 of them began patrolling along the demilitarized zone. By the end of July, the barrier had a headquarters of its own and 5 coastal surveillance centers: Da Nang, Quy Nhon, Nha Trang, Vung Tau, and On Toi. The cutters had arrived painted white. On a first night watch up at the 17th parallel, one of them took mortar and machine gun fire, and a white hull under a moon is an easy thing to see. In September, the order went out to paint them gray. One cutter never received the word and was fired on by its own side during an early patrol. Nobody was hurt, and it was repainted quickly. Corrections of that size filled the first year. To get the two navies working to the same picture, American and Vietnamese officers went to sea in each other's ships. By 1967, the thing had a shape. 9 patrol sectors covered the 1,200 miles, and each sector was built in 3 layers: an inner surface barrier, an outer surface barrier, and an air barrier above both. 3 radar stations ashore filled in behind them, and the whole of it was worked by Americans and Vietnamese together. The inner layer ran from the waterline out to 12 miles, the edge of territorial water, taking in the island of Phu Quoc at the far southwestern end. The air layer covered the band from 20 miles offshore to 120. Every inch of that 1,200-mile belt of coastal water was swept by radar every 4 to 8 hours. Around the clock, all year. On the water itself, at the end of 1966, there were 84 swift boats, 26 Coast Guard cutters, and 11 radar picket ships or other larger vessels. The Swift was 50 feet long and made 23 knots, and it became the workhorse of the whole coastal force. In the monsoon, it often gave up its sector altogether and went to find shelter. The sea worked those hulls hard enough that a crew came off a day's patrol wrung out. The cutter was 82 feet, with 1 officer and 5 men aboard her. Larger, longer-legged cutters came out in 67 and 68, along with a class of fast gunboats and a pair of hydrofoils that proved poor in this swell and too complicated for the theater's repair shops. The layers were sewn together by voice. A cutter putting to sea reported to the destroyer escort working the outer barrier and took the radar and navigation picture from her, then passed the same picture down to the Vietnamese junks working close inshore. It could not go in among them. There was not enough water under it, but it could shoot for them. That was the barrier, a fence laid across the sea, holding nothing by itself, which had to be touched by hand, boat by boat. There were far too many boats to touch them all, so an order of precedence was written down. Craft crossing the area came first, then junks inside closed areas, then boats lying at anchor, and last of all the boats working their nets. A patrol boat came in on an angle that let all its guns bear on a single point, while a second boat stood off and watched. Boarding was done in midstream, as far from either bank as the water allowed. Papers were checked and cargo was checked, and then that boat went on its way, and the patrol went on to the next. Across 1966, the American units of all 3 barriers came alongside better than 200,000 craft on that coast and stepped aboard 175,000 of them. That is 1 calendar year, by the American units alone, on 1 strip of water, with the Vietnamese junk force working the same strip beside them throughout. In August of 1966, Westmoreland put a figure on what it had bought. In 1965, he reckoned 70% of the enemy supply had come in by sea. Now it was 10. That same year, the steel trawlers tried the coast only 4 times. 1 was sunk, 1 was taken, and 2 turned back to the north. In 1967, the barrier reached 5 miles up the mouths of the larger rivers, and the first coastal sectors began passing to the Vietnamese Navy. The work itself did not change. The radar turned. The aircraft flew their long legs out over open water, and the boats went out to come alongside the next junk, and the one after that. In the autumn of 1965-4, American landing craft began working the channels of the mangrove country below Saigon, tying up at Vietnamese docks in the city between runs. They were open boats, built to put men onto a beach, and here they were used to sit on the places where the enemy crossed. It was the first American work done on this water. A short study has been ordered that August. Its finding was that the Vietnamese Navy could not both patrol the rivers and carry troops to a landing with the same boats, and that patrolling wanted something else: fast craft with radar and good radios. It recommended covering 500 miles of the main rivers, checking the traffic by day, holding a curfew across the delta by night. The boats the Vietnamese had for the rivers were converted landing craft that made no more than 9 knots. 9 knots will not catch a sampan with a motor on it, and will not enforce a curfew over a delta. In September, a conference in Saigon recommended a river patrol force of 120 boats. A recommendation, and at that point nothing more. On the 18th of December 1965, the River Patrol Force was established for a joint operation with the Vietnamese Navy called Game Warden. It was kept separate from the coastal barrier and answered to the Naval Advisory Group in Saigon. Its first operation order came out in February, and it set 4 tasks. They were short ones: patrol the main inland rivers, search suspicious craft, enforce the curfew, and keep open the main ship channel to Saigon by patrolling and sweeping the river called the My Tho, a job that went to a different set of boats. Behind all 4 lay one purpose: to make the water hard for the enemy to move and supply on, and to stop him levying on the people along it. The first patrols went to the Rung Sat, the mangrove swamp 20 miles south of Saigon. There are no roads in it at all, which is why the enemy found it convenient, and why a patrol was the only answer anyone had. In that country there is nowhere to stand, no ridge to hold, no post that covers anything. You are present where you are moving and nowhere else. The boats began arriving on the 21st of March, 1966, 11 of them, with a dock landing ship at Cot Lo, serving as a temporary base until something better could be arranged. 9 more came at the end of that month, and 12 more in April, and they ran their trials alongside the ship that was to keep them. On the 15th of April, the first river section went out. It went out at night, and it went on going out at night. For a month and a half, this whole war existed only in darkness. A boat, a length of black water, a radar screen, and the bank somewhere out to either side. Daylight patrols in the mangrove zone did not begin until the 7th of June. On the 8th of May, the first sections moved into the delta proper, to My Tho. Through that summer, the patrol spread along the Mekong arm by arm. My Tho, Vinh Long, Sa Dec, Long Xuyen, and in October it reached the Ham Luang, the last of the great branches to get one. On paper, most of the boats still belong to the zone below Saigon. In June, a river section and 2 air cushion craft were sent down to 2 of those river mouths to test an idea: that a support ship could lie in the mouth and the boats work off her. The idea was sound. The sea was not. Where the river meets open water, there is swell, and swell is the thing that stops a ship hoisting boats. The first landing ship converted for the work came out in November and took station at the mouth of the Bassac. 3 days later, she was moved up to My Tho, because the boats could not be got in and out on that swell. In December, she went back down, and in the monsoon wind could handle neither boats nor helicopters. She came up the river again. Other things were learned the same way and cost less. The air cushion craft were tried through June and found unsuitable. The water jets that drove the patrol boats gave trouble from the beginning, and in September, factory men came out and fitted modified pumps to 3 boats where they lay. In country, rather than sending anything home, the single greatest danger the river forces faced was ambush. A boat on a river cannot see around the next bend, or over a dike, or through a line of trees. A helicopter can see all three. That is the entire reason there were helicopters over the Delta, and why they became the best protection a patrol boat had. In March, 2 Army gun teams were lent to the Navy for an operation in the mangroves, one working from a ship and one from the field at My Tho. Army crews went on flying with the river force until July, when 8 Navy pilots took the job over. Westmoreland got the machines out of the Army, which also provided training, heavier repairs, and spare parts. A detachment was 2 helicopters, 8 pilots, 8 aircrew, and 8 men on the ground. They stood watches of 24 hours. A pair would answer a call up to 50 miles from where it sat. Some flights were over in 5 minutes, some ran past an hour. At the end of August, Navy crews began flying from a ship's deck on the river. The deck was small. A second helicopter could not land until the first one's rotor had come completely to a stop, which made for some long minutes when both were coming home on the last of their fuel. Between flights, the crews fueled and armed the machines themselves, sometimes with the engine running and the blades still turning over their heads. Each machine carried 3 radios on 3 different bands. A pilot could talk to the men on the ground, to the control centers, to the ships, and to other aircraft, all from the same seat. The leader of a pair sometimes became the man in charge of a situation simply because he was the only one who could speak to everybody at once. On the 1st of April 1967, the 4 detachments were made into a light attack helicopter squadron of their own. The name they flew under was not issued to them from above. They took it for themselves. They were the Sea Wolves. By that August, there were 8 detachments on airfields in the Delta and on the landing ships lying in 3 of the rivers. The rest of it arrived as routine. In July, the patrol laid its first planned ambush at a likely crossing place. Rather than waiting to meet something, in October, the force moved its headquarters down to My Tho, into the middle of the Delta, and revised rules for opening fire came into effect. None of it looked like an achievement. It accumulated. By November, the River Patrol was boarding 16,263 sampans in a single month. That is not a battle, and it is not a campaign. It is a month of coming alongside. The boats went out in the evening and came back after first light, and the ones that had been out the night before went out again the next evening. In the spring of 1965, a yard in New Bern, North Carolina, that built pleasure boats was asked what it could do about a patrol boat for rivers. The president of the company answered with a hull of fiberglass, driven by water jets instead of propellers. Jets would let a boat work in water almost too shallow to float in, and let it pass over things that would take a propeller off. The Bureau of Ships asked to see one running. His people worked around the clock and had a prototype in the water in 2 weeks, with a wooden deck and a windshield off a cabin cruiser. On the night before the demonstration, he died of a heart attack. The boat was accepted, and it worked the rivers of the Delta for the rest of the American War. And he never saw it. The Navy wrote its requirement around that idea: 25 to 30 knots, a crew of 4, a pair of heavy machine guns forward in an armored tub, 1 more gun aft, and nothing else that could be called protection, and 120 boats in less than half a year. The contract went on lowest price to a builder of small craft in Bellingham, Washington. What came off that line was about 30 feet of fiberglass. The hull the builder sold to civilians, with a deck house of the Navy's own design on top. 2 diesels of a little over 200 horsepower each, turning pumps rather than screws, a small radar on the mast for finding the way at night. On paper, it was a river patrol boat. Everyone who worked one called it the boat. The paper and the water did not agree about speed. The production boat was rated at just under 26 knots, and the boats in Vietnam never once made their trial figures. The engines almost never turned up to the revolutions they had turned up to at home. An engineman put the working truth of it plainly. Add a couple of cases of heavy ammunition, or take a patrol officer aboard, and she barely made 12. They did not agree about draft either. The requirement had asked for 9 inches underway. Loaded as she actually went out, the boat sat at 1.10 inches. One engineman went at that with his own hands. He shimmed the governors to let the engines turn faster, glued wedges under the after part of the bottom, and got 30 knots out of the boats he worked on. For all of that, the hull was the best thing about her. Fiberglass with foam between the skins did not rust and did not rot, took a beaching without complaint, and could be patched by the crew from what they had aboard. Best of all, shape charges often failed against it. There was nothing solid enough to set them off, and they went in one side and out the other without exploding. The jets gave the rest. A boat with propellers had to respect the bottom of the delta. This one could ride over a bar, run itself up onto dry ground without hurting anything that drove it, and stop or turn a full half circle inside its own length. There was almost no water in the delta it could not enter, and that had been the point of it from the start. She also handled like nothing else in the fleet. At speed, the smallest movement of the wheel brought an immediate and violent answer. At low speed, she was a stubborn brute, and to make her go where he wanted, the coxswain had to put the wheel the wrong way, because the nozzles worked backwards down there. Men learned it, and then took pleasure in laying her alongside a pier against a hard current. The pumps drew their water through gratings in the bottom, and the river fed them everything it was carrying. Blades over the intakes cut hyacinth and grass, and whatever got past the blades went into the pump. An intake choking at full speed threw the boat into a half-turn of its own. The crews called that a flying 180, and it could put loose gear and men over the side, so the intakes were cleared once or twice a patrol. Depending on what was coming down, they were on the bottom of the hull, which meant a man stripped, went over the side, worked his way underneath and cleaned them out by hand. Now and then something live had been drawn in. First they tried the cover and a broom handle. When that failed, somebody went under for it. 4 men ran her: a boat captain, an engineman, a gunner's mate, a seaman. An attack carrier of those same years went to sea with more than 2,600. Each of the 4 was trained to do the work of the other 3. And in a fight, all 4 were gunners. No other command in the Navy, and no other ship in it, handed enlisted men that much of the ship to hold. They gave themselves a mark, a black beret that nobody had authorized and that everybody wore. Some of them felt like a picked outfit and said so afterwards. Others said the opposite just as plainly, that many men had been volunteered into the river war out of other commands, and that they were no different from the crew of any other ship in the fleet. Both came from men who were there. A patrol ran about 12 hours by one account, and as long as 18 by another, and took them as much as 35 miles from their base. They worked in pairs. One came in on a craft at an angle that put all its guns on one point, and the other lay off and watched. From 9 at night to 6 in the morning, the two of them held the curfew. Food was mostly cans warmed on the exhaust manifolds. A man who wanted something else bought a small kerosene stove and cooked fish and vegetables he had got ashore. On 31 feet there was no galley and no head, no bunk and no compartment, and nowhere at all that a man was out of sight of the other three at any hour of the day or the night. The operating order of February 1966 said what the boat was and what it was not. River patrol boats, it read, were not designed, armed, or armored to stand and fight against superior fire. If a boat was taken under fire from the bank, the order was to clear the beaten zone quickly and not to trade. What she had instead of armor was the ability to leave. Where she came back to was still an open question in those years. A ship was the better answer at first because it could move and needed no ground of its own. As the shore bases grew shops and storerooms around themselves, the shore became the better answer instead. In 1966, the Navy took 4 tank landing ships, built for the last war out of mothballs, and rebuilt them for the rivers. The first of those conversions took a little over 6 months. A 10-ton boom went on to lift boats out. Helicopter deck was laid aft with lights for night work, and 18 air conditioners went into a hull built to put tanks on a beach. Ship or shore, what tied up at the end of a patrol was the same. 31 feet of pleasure hull, 4 men, no armor. By the end of 1965, Westmoreland had decided to put American troops into the Delta, and his staff went looking for somewhere to put them. 2 things came back. A force working down there would need a fleet of its own. The country was cut in every direction by water, and there was almost no dry ground to build on. What there was already had people on it. Taking land already worked would have moved many of those people off it, and Westmoreland would not do that. That left one way. The ground would have to be made. Engineers offered 4 sites that could be filled. He chose the one nearest My Tho himself, 8 kilometers from the town, and then asked the staff interpreter to find a Vietnamese name for it. The name he was given meant singleness of mind, in thoughts and in actions. It was chosen because it said something about Americans and Vietnamese working at the same job, and because an American could say it out loud. Before it could mean anything, 600 acres of flooded paddy had to be made into ground that would carry a runway and a brigade. Engineers at headquarters had done the arithmetic. With the dredges then in Southeast Asia, filling a site that size would take 17.5 dredge years. What was done instead was to pump the bottom of the river onto the fields. Sand came out of a branch of the Mekong and went down over 600 acres, 6 feet deep, the largest land reclamation project of the war. Seabees, Army engineers, and civilian contractors did the work with 5 dredges, 2 of them among the largest in the world. The first went into the water on the 4th of August, 1966. An infantry battalion came down in January to guard the men building the place. And for months afterwards, the brigade headquarters there was occupied mainly with defending it. By the 1st of June, 1967, the island of sand covered 12 square kilometers. It carried the quarters and stores of a brigade, an airstrip 500 meters long, and a turning basin 2 square kilometers in area, dredged so a boat could come within a few feet of where troops got on and off. The basin had 1 entrance, and the water in it did not move. Men who lived there said it was one of the dustiest places on earth in the dry season, and a mud hole in the wet. It had a store, a bar, and a film every evening on the repair barge. It also had the one thing the Delta would not otherwise give a sailor: somewhere to step off a boat and walk on ground. The Army half of the force had been put together at Fort Riley in Kansas in February of 1966, 3 infantry battalions and 1 of artillery, given 24 weeks and then shipped. Officers who took them over thought the training cut short and the business hurried. The force was declared in being on the 1st of June, 1967. 1,900 soldiers and 1,600 sailors. The other half of the answer to having no ground was to stop needing any. Ships and barges were fitted out to carry beds, meals, a hospital, shops that could take a boat engine to pieces, and stores for 10 days and more, and to carry it up a river. Instead of the force coming back to its base, the base went to the work and anchored there. Before the flagship sailed, lying at Pearl Harbor, her crew painted her army green. It was meant as a salute to the soldiers who would live aboard her, and as a statement of what the ship was now for. The name it earned her lasted the rest of the war. Soldiers and sailors alike called her the Green Monster. The boats came in 4 kinds, and 3 of the 4 were the mechanized landing craft of the last war, cut about and built up again. The square, slow, shallow hull that had put men onto beaches in the Pacific, and that the Vietnamese Navy had worked on these rivers for years. On the 1st of June, a squadron had 35 boats. By the autumn, it had 51. The armored troop carrier did most of the carrying, and the crews called it the Tango. It kept the landing crafts well in bow ramp, and took a platoon of 40 men, or a personnel carrier, or a howitzer with its tractor. Steel and bar armor turned machine gun fire. A rocket could still come in through the gun slots, or through the thin roof over the well. On paper it made 8 knots. The men who ran it gave another figure: 7 on a fine day, wind behind, downstream and with the tide, and 4 in ordinary conditions. The hulls were designed to weigh 66 tons, and with everything hung on them, they weighed a great deal more. 100 miles between bases took from 10 at night until 10 the next morning. The Monitor was the battleship of the force, the same hull, a rounded bow in place of the ramp, 4 more men aboard to serve what it carried. Its 40mm gun was the only weapon in the force that could break an earth bunker, and more often it damaged one than destroyed it. Its mortar was the only thing that could put fire over an obstacle instead of through it. The command boat was that same Monitor with the mortar taken out and radio sets in its place, enough to reach the ground, the air and the sea at once, so the Navy officer commanding the boats and the Army officer commanding the troops could work off one deck. 6 Monitors that came out in the spring of 1968 carried light flamethrowers and were called Zippos. One boat of the 4 was not a conversion at all. The assault support boat was drawn from the keel up and was meant to be the destroyer of this small fleet. Escort, gunboat, patrol boat, and minesweeper in one hull. Its ancestor was the riverboat the French had left behind on this water, the one the Vietnamese Navy had run since before the Americans came. Headquarters asked for 38 feet and got 50. It made almost 15 knots, twice what the troop carriers could manage, and its exhaust went down into the water. The quietest boat in the force. Between February and March of 1968, 4 of them sank for reasons that had nothing to do with fighting. The inquiry blamed too little buoyancy, not the crews. Opinion about that boat never settled. One officer called them death traps. The Commodore said plainly that he disliked the thing, and that he had watched its trials in California and said even then it would never stay afloat. And as a minesweeper, it did better than expected. It was the only boat in the force with the engines to drag buried firing wires out of the mud. Over all of it, there was no single commander. On the water, the soldiers were under the Navy. The moment they stepped ashore, they were under the Army. Back aboard, under the Navy again. Back at the base, under the Army once more. If the two sides could not agree, each went up his own chain, and the last man who could settle anything was Westmoreland. The two men who had to make that work met for the first time at Coronado, in California, and the colonel went back to Kansas in a rage, having got nothing he asked for. In Vietnam, they argued hard and often. They also settled every one of those arguments where they stood, and never once sent one up to be decided for them. So the thing stood in two pieces on the same river. An island of sand 8 kilometers from My Tho, with a runway and a basin of still water cut into its side, and a town of ships at anchor with everything 3,500 men needed for 10 days aboard, able to weigh and be somewhere else by morning. The first operations of the riverine force went out from Dong Tom in the first week of June 1967, and they went no further than the country around the base. The point of them was not to find anyone. It was to run the procedures through once, with real boats and real rifle companies, and see where they caught. Loading began at the ship's side. Cargo and ammunition went into the boats before any man stepped aboard. Then 3 armored troop carriers came alongside the floating pontoons, and 3 platoons went down into them at once. A full rifle company was usually loaded in 20 minutes. Navy swimmers stood on the pontoons in case somebody went into the water between the hulls. The soldiers kept radio silence from the moment they were aboard. 2 boats went out well ahead of the rest, each towing a steel hook on a cable off a fast winch, dragging the bottom on either flank of the channel. Behind them came the sections, 1 monitor and 3 troop carriers to a rifle company. In the order the battalion commander wanted his companies to land. Between the hooks and the first monitor lay a stretch of empty water that nobody wanted to shorten. Inside a section, the boats ran 5 to 10 meters apart. Between one company and the next, there were 200 or 300 meters of empty water. Where a small stream met the river, the water was 100 meters across, but in the streams themselves it was 15 to 25. That is the shape of the whole thing, a corridor with a floor of water, 2 banks near enough to touch, and both banks belonging to somebody else. Most of the movement was at night, and at night the bank does not read. The main instrument of navigation was radar. Control points were marked along the route and reported as the column passed them, to the headquarters following the force. From anywhere but the boats themselves, a column strung out along a stream that narrow was hard to keep track of. The tide set the timetable. 30 kilometers upstream against the ebb could take 6 hours. The same 30 kilometers on the flood took 4.5. So the force went in on the rising water, which bought speed and left a long period of high water after it arrived. The 2 services also agreed that the boats would go only into streams wide enough to turn a boat around in. The landings were made at first light. When the leading boats were 500 meters from the beaches, the artillery came off the banks, and at that moment the boats began firing themselves into both sides of the stream, each holding its arc until the troop carrier going in ahead masked the guns. Then the sections put their bows into the mud 3 at a time, so that a company came ashore whole. Often the landing place could not be seen at all. Banana groves, coconut palms, and nipa grew down to the waterline. Then the battalion commander flew above it and marked the place with colored smoke, and the boat steered at the smoke. The ramps went down. The soldiers went over them, and the boat stayed until they were released, to give fire, to take blocking stations, or to sit at a pickup point and wait. Every boat carried a number, a colored pennant on the mast, and 3 running lights in tiers near the masthead. The combination of colors told a soldier lying behind a dike which boat was his. The boat that put a unit ashore took it off again, by a different route where there was one. Coming out was reckoned no safer than going in. Artillery was the harder problem. The banks were steep and the water climbed and fell against them all day, and getting a gun tractor off a landing craft and up a bank like that was next to impossible. So the gun stopped going ashore. A howitzer was set on a pontoon barge, its trails braced against lengths of telephone pole, and laid on stakes driven into the bank. 6 such barges were built, 2 guns on each towed into the streams by a troop carrier. What the barge could do that a gun on land could not was arrive. On the 1st of April 1967, a battery was brought up the river in the dark, with infantry following behind in troop carriers. And when it came level with the objective, it fired over open sights. No road in the Delta would have taken a battery there. The ground commander thought the barges the most important equipment the Army gave the force. By September, the force had been doing this for 3 months. In the middle of the month, it worked a district called Bon Long for 3 days, and that operation cost it 9 men killed and 23 out of action, all in one battalion. Then the boats came back and were loaded again. On the 15th of September, the objective lay along a stream called the Rachba Rai in the Kam Son district, and the brigade commander had planned the approach with care. The preparatory and reconnaissance fires were to be held back until the column was through a wide bend in the stream that the Americans called Snoopy's Nose. Helicopters were to stay off the area until the same moment. The firing began from the bank at about 7:30 in the morning, before the bend was behind them. It came from both sides at once, from positions at the water's edge, at a range that in a stream that width is counted in tens of meters and not in hundreds. The monitors and the sweeping boats answered into both banks. The column kept moving because moving was what a column was for. For the first 15 or 20 minutes, almost nothing came over the command net. Boats were maneuvering to bring guns to bear, or to keep clear of boats that had lost steering, and smoke was sitting on the water. Nobody anywhere had a picture of what was happening. Not the boat crews, not the battalion staff, not the officer watching from the helicopter. The picture assembled itself later, in pieces, and mostly after it mattered. At 7:02, the officer commanding the boats ordered the column to turn back and reform at the alternate beaches. 2 of his sweeping boats were damaged, and he could not sweep as far as the upper landing, and taking the column on without sweeps in front of it was outside what the Navy allowed. He did not know at that minute that one boat had already got past the bend and put its troops ashore. The battalion commander was above the column in his helicopter, and what he could see was that the boats were still making way. He did not change his mind about landing. His operations officer was riding a command boat, and the decision came down that way. From the air to the boat to the boats, put the troops ashore. At about 10, the column turned around a second time and went back up the stream. The second run got through and the companies landed. Between 7:30 that morning and 4 in the afternoon, The boats of that one column fired more than 10,000 40-millimeter rounds, more than 7,000 20-millimeter, and more than 60,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition. One column, one stream, one day. The next morning the infantry searched the ground, saw nothing more after 4:30, and the operation was declared finished. In October, the force worked in the mangrove country between Saigon and the sea as well, putting ambush parties along the banks at night and patrols on the water. When it was not out, it owed the anchorage its own protection. Boats on the water, divers on the anchor cables and hulls, charges dropped into the water at odd hours. Then the next operation was ordered, and in the dark, the column formed up again. The Long Tho is the deep water channel between Saigon and the South China Sea. Ships coming into the country's most important port came up it, and there was no other way for them to come. From the sea to the city is 45 miles of river, and the minesweeping boats ran those 45 miles several times a day, at 5 to 7 knots, which is roughly the speed of a man walking. For most of its length the channel runs through swamp. 400 square miles of mangrove lie about 20 miles south of Saigon. Tropical forest, salt marsh, miles of small streams, and no road network of any kind. At high water a sampan can reach any point in it. At the end of 1965, the government held a narrow strip of villages along the coast. The channel could not be gone around. One merchant ship put out of action in a narrow reach would do it. The ship would lie where it stopped, and lifting it clear might take weeks, and for those weeks the port of Saigon would be shut. That is why the river had to be clean in the morning, and why it had to be made clean again the morning after. The first arrangement was temporary. From September 1965, 4 36-foot boats ran out of Saigon into the mangrove country, checking sampans and junks along the channel. In those months they were fired on more than 20 times. In February 1966, a Panamanian coaster took recoilless rifle fire in the hull and the superstructure 18 miles below the city, and went aground and got off again and carried on. The point had been made. In May 1966, a minesweeping unit was formed at Nha Bay, 10 miles southeast of Saigon, where the Long Tho comes together with the Soi Rap. There was no dry ground there to speak of. The men lived in a tent camp on land that flooded, on raised floors, walking between the tents on planking taken off the supply ships. By June 12, sweep boats were working out of it. The sweep boat was 57 feet long, with a crew of 6 and 11 knots flat out if nothing was dragging behind. It carried one heavy machine gun and a few lighter ones, and no armor at all. It had been designed for the shallow water of bays and rivers. Slow, unarmored, and lightly armed is a poor combination on a river, with a tree line down both sides of it. On the 23rd of August 1966, a mine went off under a transport of the Military Sea Transport Service in the Channel, the SS Baton Rouge Victory. It tore a hole in her port side 16 feet by 45. She had to be run aground deliberately, so that she would not settle in the fairway and close it. 7 men of her engine room were killed. It was the heaviest single loss the American merchant fleet took from enemy action in the war. Before that August, the sweeping of the channel had been a measure. After it, it was an organization. The number of boats went up. The passes went from occasional to several a day, and the river acquired a routine that did not depend on whether anything had happened the day before. The channel was swept in the morning whether or not there was any reason to think it needed sweeping. Sweeping meant a chain drag. The boat towed a length of chain along the bottom with prongs on the end of it. The prongs bit into the mud, and what they were looking for was wire. The firing leads of command-detonated mines, buried in the silt, and run out to a firing point on the bank. It is a rake, pulled at walking pace over the same ground, day after day. The mines were not laid in mid-channel. They were laid close in against the bank, because that was where the sweep boats worked, and both sides knew it. So the sweepers spent their days in the part of the water nearest to the tree line. Cutting back the vegetation along the banks was one of the standing tasks of the riverine force, listed alongside landings, sweeps, ambushes, and escort. In August 1966, one of the sweep boats was mined and fired on in the same minute. The crew shored and patched 2 flooded compartments forward and kept her afloat. On the 1st of November, the same boat was mined again, off a firing point at the edge of the water, and went down slowly. She was raised later and towed to the yard at Saigon. She was the first sweep boat lost to a mine in the war. In February 1967, 5 sweep boats were attacked on that river inside a single day, some from the bank with recoilless rifles, one by a mine fired from the shore. That was the worst of it. After that month, no sweep boat was sunk in an ambush again, and for the rest of the war, the mine-sweeping unit did not lose a man killed. The answers to all this were small ones. In the spring of 1967, the boats were given 40mm grenade launchers, which let them put fire up and over into the banks instead of only along them. Later that year, the first of 6 converted landing craft arrived, with steel hulls, twin screws, and a better drag. The other side went on working too. Late in 1967, a mine went off on a stretch that had been swept 15 minutes earlier, and the method came out afterwards. The firing wire had been threaded through 2 sections of areca palm trunk, each about 6 inches through and 15 feet long, with about 10 feet of bare wire between them. The chain had passed over the logs and left the wire alone. It came in waves after that. In April 1968, the mining picked up again, and the sweeps were coming in with quantities of electrical wire dragged out of the mud. 10 attacks on merchant shipping were counted along the water in May, and 8 in August. It was a season like the rain, and it was answered the same way every morning. In the summer of 1968, the work began to change hands. The Vietnamese Navy took over the clearing of command-detonated mines, which was the common kind on that river, and the American boats kept the moored ones. 14 American river craft went across with the job. 6 sweep boats and 8 patrol boats, and with them the whole responsibility for keeping the channel to Saigon swept. The Navy had, in the end, enough small sweepers to keep the channel open and reasonably safe for merchant shipping for the length of the war, apart from a few short periods. The other side never closed the My Tho and never closed the port of Saigon. What that took was not a victory anywhere on a map. It took a boat at 5 knots with a chain down, over the same 45 miles, twice a day. A road stays a road only as long as somebody sweeps it. In the morning, the boats came out of Nia Bay with their drags down and went towards the sea, and in the afternoon they came back the other way, and the ships came up the river behind them. The next morning, the same 45 miles were swept again from the beginning, as though nothing had ever been done to them. The tide came in twice a day and went out twice a day, and each time it turned the current in the rivers and canals around. A boat that lay against a bank in the evening could be hanging over mud by morning, tilted on its side and going nowhere. Get the hour of a landing wrong, and the boat sat down in that mud and stayed there until the water came back for them. Running with the tide and running against it were two different days of work. The same stretch of water took one time going up and another coming back, and when a boat could be somewhere was set by the water rather than the clock. The commodore of the riverine force built slack into every plan for it. It cost his crews hours, and he did it anyway. Rain came with the southwest monsoon from the middle of May to the beginning of October. In those months, the ground stood under water because the water had nowhere to go, and typhoon rain came from July into December. The dry season ran from November to the middle of March. Between them, the country stayed hot and wet and low, and what the season changed most was how far a boat could get. From June to November, most of the canals would take a hull drawing more than 6 feet. For the rest of the year, most of them would not. That moved the line between what could be reached and what could not, and it moved it for everybody at once. The map stayed the same. What it meant did not. Crews on the small boats worked in shower sandals, cut-off trousers and t-shirts, and went ashore rarely. Aboard one ship in the hot months, almost nobody was in uniform at all. Soldiers who had spent 48 hours in the water needed a day out of it to dry, and nothing shortened that but air and sun. Boots came in of loose plastic mesh, so water left as fast as it entered. The rivers here are tidal, and the water in them is brackish and no good to drink. Fresh water came from wells, from rain caught and stored, from engineer water points, from distilling and from hauling it in. Where they caught rain, the ration was 5 gallons a man a day. Salt water did the washing and the laundry, and the rule with it was not to take it into your mouth. On the boats, a man washed by tying a line to a bucket and dipping it over the side. Meals came out of cans. Everybody knew the trick. Tear off a square inch of plastic explosive and light it, and it brought a can up to warm in about 30 seconds. Ham and lima beans nobody wanted, and a case of them could ride in a boat for a month untouched. Aboard the barrack ship, it was another life. More than 1,000 men were fed 3 times a day. The laundry ran around the clock, and the barber shop cut hair more than 100 times in a day. On the ship that supported the patrol boats, there was food at any hour, because the patrols came back at all hours. Supply came on a schedule a man could keep a calendar by. A store ship stayed with the force 7 days. Then a second came out with 10 days aboard, and the first went off to fill up again. Fuel came by barge every 10 days. The barrack ship sailed with 30 days of provisions, frozen and chilled and dry, and went back for more when it was down to 15. Boats were always in repair. A hull came out of the water on the crane, went into the well deck of the support ship, and went back in. Shafts did not last in that water. Fiberglass chipped where boats came alongside sampans and junks day after day, and hairline cracks let water in between the skins of the hull. The foam inside soaked it up, and the boat grew slower without anyone seeing why. The repair was to lift the boat, drill 1/4-inch holes along the keel, let it drain and close the holes with fiberglass. On the assault boats, the cooling strainers filled with river trash, and changing them over could take 40 minutes. Every base kept a standing queue of small jobs like that, and the queue never emptied, because the water the boats worked in was the same water that was wearing them out. Bases grew the way anything grows on wet ground. One began as a tent city at the edge of a football field, until tropical huts with screens and louvers went up. Another stood on marsh. with raised floors and walkways of ship's dunnage. There, a Vietnamese baker who had worked for the French ambassador sold bread, and spotter pilots put their aircraft down on the road to buy it. Between patrols, the routine was easy. Berthing spaces were air-conditioned, and there was a film every other night at the largest of the river bases. On the repair barge, a man could shower whenever he liked, with no limit on the hot water. Beer was 3.2% and drunk on the pontoon the boats tied up to, because the ships themselves were dry. Night was quiet work. Boats ran on one engine where they could because sound carried, and they drifted with the engine shut down and listened to the water. Radio traffic was kept short. It was taken for granted that the other side was listening. Routes were picked at random. The boats worked in pairs, each within radar sight of the other, usually out in the middle. Men slept in the gun tubs curled up, on folding cots in the well deck, and in the open on the stern. Most of them slept aboard the boats by choice. It was the one place a man could be by himself, and if something happened in the dark, he was already where he had to be. Mosquitoes and gnats worked over anybody sleeping in the open. 3 days of that and a crew came apart. A boat is a visible, concentrated point target that cannot be dug in, so it has to be ready to move at any second. After 3 days of that, the report said, effectiveness dropped away. One helmsman stood 14 hours at the wheel in a helmet and flak jacket. A tour was a year, and leave out of the country was an event of its own. So this war was counted in tides and not in days. One watch, then another, then the same water again, running the other way. Nothing was taken here and nothing was held. The river was where it had been, doing twice a day what it does, and the boats went back out into it on the schedule the water gave them. On the 27th of January, 1968, the riverine force shifted its moorings from My Tho eastward to Vinh Long to work against supply movement in the provinces around it. The same day an official 7-day holiday truce began. The Delta had not been quiet that month. Boats had been shot at from the banks, and one boat had burned for an hour and come off the list of ships. The river patrol kept account of men of military age stopped on the water without papers. In November, there were 356 of them. By the end of December, 774. By the end of January, 1,257. That was a monthly tally kept by the patrol itself, and nobody at the time drew a conclusion from it. The departing senior American advisor in the Delta had said publicly on the 9th of January that the enemy in his zone was poorly motivated and poorly trained, and that the South Vietnamese army had taken the upper hand. More than half of that army was away on holiday leave. Units in the towns were standing skeleton watches, which is what the truce was for. On the 30th of January, attacks came in against 8 towns in the 2 northern Corps areas, and the truce was canceled. In the Delta the following morning, 13 of the 16 provincial capitals were attacked. Large sections of Ben Tre, Con Tho, Chau Doc, My Tho, and Vinh Long were in enemy hands on the first day. Across the whole country on that date, 29 of the 44 provincial capitals were struck. Ben Tre is the capital of an island province that has no bridge to any of its neighbors, and about 74,000 people live there. It was hit at 4:15 in the morning by about 800 men out of 2 battalions, and within 16 hours they held nearly all of it. What the Allies still held was a few blocks around the American advisory compound, with about 70 Americans inside. The riverine force was working a canal in the west of Din Tuong province when the orders came that afternoon. One company was to go by helicopter to hold the airfield at Vin Long, another to Dong Tam to thicken the base guard. Coming out, the column took fire from both banks of a canal 30 meters wide, and it ran through that fire for 25 minutes to reach open water. The commodore of the riverine force was Robert Salzer. He had come to Vietnam thinking that river forces were better used to cut the movement of supplies than to hunt main units, and had been told no. On the 31st of January, he was in the command center at Dong Tam with his army counterpart, and when it was clear My Tho was close to falling, they moved without asking Saigon, which was under attack itself. That night the force lay alongside its floating base, fueling, striking down ammunition, resting a few hours while it waited for orders. The roads of the Delta were closed and would stay closed. What the force had that nobody else had was the ability to move in the dark on water. And My Tho was an hour's run away down the main river. 3 battalions and a sapper company, about 1,200 men, had come into My Tho. About half the soldiers who should have been defending it had gone home for the holiday. In the town were an armored cavalry squadron, 1 South Vietnamese infantry battalion, the Vietnamese river groups, and the American sailors who lived there. In the middle of the afternoon of the 1st of February, 3 infantry companies landed on the southwestern edge of the town without opposition and began working north. 2 more companies and part of another battalion came in behind them. The assistant division commander, who wrote the Army's account of these operations afterward, said the town had to be cleared slowly and systematically. By 10 in the morning of the 2nd of February, the last pockets north of the town were cleared. At 1 minute past noon, the column left again, up towards Kai Lei, to get across the line of withdrawal. My Tho had taken 3 days. Nobody in the force went to Ben Tre. While it worked at My Tho, Ben Tre was held mainly by aircraft and by the guns of the river patrol boats. Those boats had come up the canal into Ben Tre from the Ham Luang River. One of them took more than 40 hits before another towed it clear. Crews worked most of 4 days that way, with short runs out to the landing ship on the Ham Luang for fuel, ammunition, and food, and back again. Between those runs, 2 boats would lie out in the middle of the river at idle while the gunners refilled their belts. Vin Long is a larger town than Ben Tre, 110,000 people, on the Co Chien River, with a joint boat base on the water and an airfield 2 miles east of it. The logistics detachment there was 22 sailors and 3 officers, and it supported 144 men at the boat base. Fighting in the town ran on for 4 days. On the 4th of February, South Vietnamese units, Rangers, and the arriving riverine force cleared the western part of the town, and 2 battalions of the 9th Division were put in south of it by helicopter and by boat to close the ring. For the province as a whole, enemy losses were given in American reports as 138. American losses were 2 dead and 14 wounded. Ben Tre was clear on the 5th of February. Between the 29th of January and the 7th of February, enemy losses in these operations were reported at 269, and the riverine force lost 12 men. On the 12th of February, the operations to take the pressure off My Tho and Vin Long ended. After that, the fighting was no longer about the towns entered on the first morning. Can Tho was the exception. It had been struck on the 31st of January like the rest, and was still a problem in the middle of February. It is a town of about 166,000 on the Bassac, the capital of Phong Dinh province, and American intelligence put some 2,500 enemy troops around it. Getting there from Dong Tam was 110 miles. That was one of the longest moves the force made in the war, and it took it a long way from the supply line it normally worked off. On the 14th of February, 2 river assault squadrons landed 2 infantry battalions south of the town. On the 22nd, there was a joint operation with a South Vietnamese division at Phong Hiep, south of the city. On the 27th and 28th of February, the force put a blockade across the water for 2 days. More than 40 assault boats and more than 10 patrol boats holding the banks of the Bassac and the mouths that fed it. American losses over those 2 days were 19 soldiers and 2 sailors killed, and 97 wounded. Enemy losses to the gunfire of the boats were reported at 68. Across the month, the riverine force had lifted troops into 8 provinces of the Delta and supplied them where they stood. Gunfire, ammunition, water, food, medical help. As the fire brigade of the Delta, it had covered about 1,000 kilometers. Orders were mostly verbal, and the planning was done while moving. In freeing My Tho, Ben Tre, and Vinh Long, and easing the pressure at Can Tho, enemy losses were reported at 544. On the 3rd of March, the force left Can Tho and went back up to Dong Tam. Can Tho was the last of the large towns of the Delta to be seriously threatened. The sweeps went on in the country outside, through the spring and into the summer, but the town fighting was finished, and the boats went back to the water they had come off a month before. A patrol on a Delta canal once saw a wire, 1/4 of an inch thick, coming out of the water and up the bank into the brush. They followed it. At the end of it lay a mine of 10 kilograms, and beside the mine, food and fresh water. The wire ran the other way as well, into the river, and a disposal team from Nia Bay lifted a larger charge out of the channel. Around that spot was the rest of what the position needed: 3 firing pits dug into the bank, 2 reels of wire, a directional mine set to face the water, and stakes driven into the bottom of the canal, so that only their tops showed, which from a passing boat looked like drifting rubbish, and are in fact another man's range marks. Of everything that threatened boats on the inland water, 2 things stood first: fire from the bank at close range and the charge under the hull. Neither can be dodged. A boat in a narrow canal cannot go around and cannot turn. So the work was never avoidance. It was a long list of small measures, each of which made one of the 2 a little less likely. The river mine was fired by wire, by a man watching, at the moment the target reached the one point he had chosen. That is what made it different from a mine that waits, and it also made the answer plain. There was little use in hunting for the charge itself. What could be done was to break the wire that led to it. Every column put 2 sweeps out in front of it with hooks down, and on ordinary patrols, the boats trailed a plain chain astern. From on board, it is not a shot and not an explosion. It is a winch working somewhere forward, and then a length of wire coming up out of the mud with nothing on the end of it. That happened often enough that nobody came out to look. Most detonations came on the way back. The route out is unknown to the men waiting. The route home is that route reversed, and by then the watching has loosened. Mining was usually laid on together with small arms and automatic fire. The enemy knew what the boats could do and roughly when they came, and preferred, for both the mine and the ambush, the predictable half of the day. Ambushes on the bank were usually set in daylight and at low water, from covered positions on the narrow stretches. That runs against the picture the word carries. Night on these waterways was the time of crossings, and therefore the time of the patrol. The day belonged to the position on the bank, and the night to boats looking for movement across the water. Warning ran ahead of a patrol by colored lights, by gongs and bells, by single shots. Two methods of setting the position were used: draw the boat toward one bank with fire, or fire from one bank to push it across to the other, where the guns actually are. Both of them need the boat to keep going forward. In the ambushes, recoilless guns of 57 and 75 millimeters, worked with automatic weapons, were used more often than mines. The reason was practical. A gun does not need the target at one exact point. It can be shifted while the target moves, and it is easier to put in place. The mine was the more patient of the two, and the sweep hook went out ahead of the column in any case. Width decided a great deal. Where a small stream came out into a river, the water might be 100 meters across. Further in, it narrowed to 25 meters, and to 15. At 15, the bank is nearer than the boat is long. Turning off the big rivers into the small waterways raised the danger from recoilless guns, rockets, and mines all together. On water that narrow, a boat cannot come about. The only way back is astern, the way it came in. Nor can it always bring its guns to bear, because without standoff from the bank, the mounts will not depress far enough to reach a firing pit at the water's edge. Low water made both of those worse and added grounding. One patrol section kept two standing prohibitions: no narrow canals, and never on a falling tide. Close range here is not a figure of speech. On the 4th of December, 1967, on the Rach Ruong Canal, a battalion fired anti-tank grenades at a column at point-blank distance and put 43 of them into the boats. At that width, the boat does not maneuver out of anything. It goes through, and the guns along its sides answer what they can see. The bar armor on the armored troop carriers was built for that. A rocket grenade striking the outer grid would burst there, on the grid, without reaching the plate behind it, and most of the time it worked. It did not always work. By the later years, heavier weapons were reaching the boats, and the grid alone no longer settled the question. By the summer of 1967, the bunkers along the banks were holding against a 40-millimeter round, and the flotilla went looking for something that would open them. In October, an Army flamethrower was fitted into an armored troop carrier. A stream of 32 seconds, out to 150 yards. The trials went well. At 23,000 pounds, it was more weight than the boats could carry. Lighter sets went into 6 monitors the following May, 2 to a boat. Those reached 200 or 300 yards and could burn for as long as 225 seconds. The work was the bunker the boat guns could not open, and the belt of growth at the water's edge that hid a position. Another conversion carried a heavy water jet and washed bank bunkers down. Suspect stretches of a route were fired on in advance. The last of the measures was overhead. The Navy stood up its own light attack helicopter squadron at Vung Tau in April of 1967, and by August it was 8 detachments of 2 aircraft each, sitting at Bin Tui, Dong Tam, Vin Long, and Nha Bay as well, and aboard landing ships out on the rivers. The machines were Army helicopters with door guns. What the naval crews brought to them was instrument training and the habit of flying at night and in weather. A radar altimeter was added, and it was not a luxury. The flight decks on the river patrol ships were rudimentary, and the work came at night and in rain. The radios reached ground troops, command posts, ships, and other aircraft at once. A boat that lost its steering in one of those stretches was taken in tow by the boat behind it, which is most of what working in pairs was for. The second hull was not protection. It was the certainty of another boat in the water close enough to pass a line, and that the crew of the first one would not be left to drift down onto the near bank. None of it was a solution, and nobody called it one. Each piece moved the odds a little, a wire cut before the boats came up, a grenade spent on a grid, a stretch of bank burned back from the water. The patrol went up in the morning and came down in the afternoon, past the same bends, looking at the same bank from the other side. In the last days of September 1968, a new commander took over the naval forces in Vietnam, and in his first weeks, he flew the Delta to see what the boats did. His conclusion was that the work those forces had been built for was finished. Trawlers no longer came in from the sea. Movement on the big rivers had stopped. The force was intact and the task had gone. What he saw on the chart was a line. Water runs along the Cambodian border almost without a break. From the west by canal to the big rivers, across the flat middle of the delta, then 2 rivers down either side of the salient that points at Saigon. Several hundred kilometers of it. The method until then had been to go where something had happened. Now it was to stand where the goods had to cross. 4 interdiction lines went in inside about 10 weeks. Search turned in November of 1968 on 2 canals in the far west. Tran Hung Dao later that same month on the Border River and the long canal beyond it. Giant Slingshot in December on the 2 rivers beside the salient. Barrier Reef in January of 1969 across the flat country between them. On the 2nd of November, the first opened on 2 nearly parallel canals running from the west inland to a town on the Bassac, 40 miles back from the border. That pair carried the main supply route from Cambodia into the middle of the delta. Armored boats went in first and spent 5 days fighting the water open. River patrol boats came in behind them and stayed to hold it. The second line came out of an accident. On the 14th of October, a junior lieutenant named Bernique took his boat up a small river in the west, closed to American craft because it ran so near the border, and fought there. The crews afterwards called it Bernique's Creek. In the middle of November, boats were ordered onto it to see whether a line could be held there, and 5 days of heavy reaction answered that. A canal 65 kilometers long and about 35 meters across carries that line east straight the whole way. It takes boats all year except at the end of the dry season, from the middle of April to the beginning of June. When it went shallow, the crossings were covered by parties on foot, by sensors, and from the air. The third line, the hardest worked of the 4, went onto the 2 rivers that come down either side of the salient. The piece of Cambodia called the Parrot's Beak, which reaches within 25 miles of Saigon, and join in a V southwest of the city. It began in December, was at full stretch by January, and that first whole month brought 68 shootings at patrol groups. Last in was the 4th, during the first days of January, closing the gap between the western lines and the 2 rivers. A canal system of 88 kilometers across the plain of reeds to the upper Mekong. It sits 10 to 30 kilometers back from the border, further off than the rest. That country is so flat and open that a party caught crossing is worse placed than in the growth. On all of them, the tactic was the same, and it was a quiet one. A boat went in against the bank, shut its engines down, and waited for someone to try the water in front of it, instead of running the river and announcing itself. 3 of every 4 patrols and operations of the campaign were worked at night. The one limit was low water. With the bank standing high, a stopped boat was easier to reach. Behind the lines was a new organization, 3 forces that had worked almost separately: the coastal one, the one on the big rivers, and the river assault force, came under a single command and were handled as one river fleet, with the heavy armored boats used as ships of the line and the light ones as cruisers. It was run day to day by Robert Salzer, who had taken the assault force through the winter fighting. The 2 rivers by the salient set their own problem. The main base lay at the confluence, and the patrol sectors ran 50 miles out, which meant boats spending their nights traveling to work. So the base was taken to them. Pontoon barges, 30 feet by 90, towed to places where the bank gave natural cover and anchored. A developed post was an acre or less of high bank with 3 or more barges made fast alongside, quarters and a galley, storerooms, a magazine, a command post, a radio room, a helicopter pad, an engine space with the generators. One kept a division of 10 boats and 65 men. Screens stood out beyond the perimeter so a grenade would burst on the wire and not on a barge, and depth charges went over the side through the night. At the far end of the Delta, on the 27th of June 1969, a base was anchored in the middle of the Kwa Lone River, on the Ka Mau Peninsula, 200 miles southwest of Saigon, opposite an abandoned town. It was called Sea Float. The Vietnamese Navy had been pushed off that peninsula early in the 60s, and its commander wanted it back. Ground there was judged too exposed for a base ashore. The barges were assembled in Saigon, carried by landing ships to the mouth of the Bodo and towed up from there. Mooring them was the difficult part. The tide there runs to 6 and 8 knots, so the complex was moored on 6 points forward and aft, on anchors of 9,000 pounds with concrete weights under them. 13 barges in the end, one carrying a helicopter pad. Swimmers with mines and shelling from the banks were beaten off. The staff that measured this used 2 kinds of indicator. The indirect ones were things the enemy did that he had not done before: moving in daylight, going quiet where he was known to be active, and, counted the same way, more ambushes, more mining of the canals, more sapper attacks on the bases. A rise in attacks on a line was read as evidence that it was working. Direct indicators came from American intelligence: shortages of weapons, food, and supplies, and what those shortages did to his operations. The conclusion drawn was that the lines obliged him to build stocks up far in advance and held back what a large operation needs. They also moved him. Each new line pushed the traffic further northeast along the border, and the next was laid where it had gone. Over the first months of work, the counts came out very unevenly. The 2 rivers by the salient produced 1,044 fire contacts. The line across the flat country between them, 77. The western pair fell between. The same method laid across different ground did different work. Where the water was narrow and the bank close, boats were shot at. Where the country was open, the traffic went elsewhere, and the line stood quiet. The crossing places were given up slowly and unwillingly, even after they were known and watched. Parties on the march could not talk to one another, and the men who did get through needed a long time to report it. So the same crossings were tried again, and the boats went back to the same bends and shut their engines down, and waited there on the water in the dark. In the first days of November 1968, at a conference in Saigon, where every service gave its briefing in turn, the new commander of American naval forces in Vietnam set out a plan. Elmo R. Zumwalt Jr. had been in the country a few weeks. What he proposed was that the boats go to the Vietnamese Navy faster than anyone had scheduled. The theater commander approved it. The final plan was signed on the 12th of February, 1969. Its name was Accelerated Turnover to the Vietnamese, shortened to ACTO-V, and the short form had been chosen on purpose because it sounded like the word active. After that, it was simply the turnover program, a list of boats, crews, schools, and dates laid over a war that did not pause. One decision came before the others, and it was about language. The Vietnamese would be taught English rather than the Americans taught Vietnamese. The reasons given were practical. The technical vocabulary of modern marine machinery did not exist in Vietnamese, and the head of the Vietnamese Navy, Tran Van Chon, held that a navy was an international service and wanted his men to have an international language. In January of 1969, a joint school for boat crews opened in Saigon, run by the two navies together, with English pushed hardest of all. Inside the building stood a full mock-up of a river patrol boat, fixed in place on the floor, so a class could take the boat apart and put it back together without going near the water. Charles Chick Raux Jr. was responsible for the program and for the school. The unit in which the exchange was made was that crew of 4. One Vietnamese sailor was put aboard, and the crew became 5. 4 Americans and 1 Vietnamese in a boat built for 4, with no compartment in her to put a 5th man. The crowding was not a side effect. It was the mechanism, and there was no gentler way to run it. When the new man was certified in his job, 1 American came off and a 2nd Vietnamese went on. 5 again. 3 Americans and 2 Vietnamese. Then the gunner. Then the engineman, 1 for 1. The boat captain was taught last, because his was the job that took longest to learn, and the one everything else in the boat depended on. On the day the boat captain was certified, the boat itself passed to the Vietnamese Navy. It did not go anywhere. It went on patrolling alongside American boats in the same patrol areas, under the same American section commander, until enough boats had certified crews to make up a whole unit. What was handed over was a boat, 1 boat at a time, not a unit. Teaching went on aboard, and in the engine room it was painted on. Piping was colored by system, the direction of flow marked with a stenciled arrow, so that the instructions sat on the metal and did not depend on which language a man read. Tran Van Chon thought the work done on the boats ran ahead of the translated manuals, which arrived when they arrived. The first large handover came on the 1st of February, 1969, 25 boats of the River Assault Force, with both commanders present and both ensigns at the ceremony. The boats did not stand down afterwards. They were made into 2 Vietnamese river assault and interdiction divisions and went into the border barrier campaign within weeks. On water they had been working already. By then the river assault force itself was ending. Its last large operation had been in the U Minh Forest in August of 1968. In the summer of 1969, the 9th Infantry Division went home. The force turned over 64 more boats and stopped operating. It was struck from the rolls on the 25th of August, the first major American naval command in Vietnam to be shut down. The river patrol boats followed. On the 11th of August 1969, 10 of them changed hands, the first river patrol boats the Vietnamese Navy had ever held. In October, another 80 went across and were formed into 4 Vietnamese patrol groups, which went into the barrier work at once. At the end of that month, 13 of the fast coastal boats followed them. A separate program covered the Coast Guard cutters with a name of its own, scatter, its own timetable, and its own property, under the same general idea. The two were never one program. In January of 1969, 2 Vietnamese lieutenants joined the cutters. A month later, 17 warrant officers and 2 more lieutenants arrived, and after that, Vietnamese sailors came into the crews in batches. On the 16th of May, 1969, the first 2 cutters, Point Garnet and Point League, changed hands in Saigon and became Le Phuoc Du and Le Vananga. By August, the Vietnamese repair section was pulling and replacing engines on its own. On the 15th of August, 1970, the last 2 of the 26 cutters went across, and the American squadron went off the list that day. Of the 56 Coast Guard ships and cutters in this war, 30 went to the Vietnamese Navy. Counted from the 1st of January, 1969, to the 30th of September, 1970, 514 units of every kind had gone to the Vietnamese Navy. 250 of them were river patrol boats. More than 100 were larger coastal craft and ships. That is what the accumulated total covers, and it covers those months and no others. Another reckoning was made at the end. By December of 1970, the American command turned over what remained of its river combat fleet, 293 river patrol boats, and 224 assault craft. That same month, the river patrol force was disestablished, and the number it had carried went to a new headquarters for the Delta. On the 30th of September, 1970, the strength of the Vietnamese Navy was reported at 39,136 men. Between the autumn of 1968 and the spring of 1970, its personnel had doubled, and the monthly output of its own schools had risen 7-fold. A navy growing at that rate needed everything at once, and most of it had to be taught. More than 500 officers and men of the Naval Advisory Group did that work on the boats and on the supply bases, and ran the recruit training centers at Saigon, Nha Trang, and Cam Ranh. The rule for finishing was plain. When the American commander was satisfied that his students would manage without him, his people went home and the unit passed across. Americans in the Delta grew fewer that way, command by command. In March of 1970, the Vietnamese Navy took command of the border barrier along the Cambodian frontier. By the end of that summer, every interdiction barrier was under Vietnamese command, and the Americans left on them were advisors. The barriers went across one at a time and took Vietnamese names. Zumwalt gave up the command on the 15th of May, 1970, 20 months after he had taken it. The boats went out the next morning the way they had gone out the morning before. Down the same canals, into the same patrol areas, past the same bends. What had changed was the ensign at the stern and the voices on the radio net. Nothing on the water marked the difference. The work went on being the same work, and it belonged to somebody else. More than 174,000 American sailors served in South Vietnam between 1960 and 1972. That is the figure the Navy's own history gives, and it arrives with its frame attached. Those years, that country, that service, every other number kept about this war on the water comes the same way, with a start date, an end date, one force, and one stretch of water fixed to it. At the height of the Navy's part in the war, the coastal and river forces together held more than 30,000 sailors and over 350 patrol vessels, from riverboats up to destroyers. The history does not name the month that peak fell in. It says only that this was the peak, and the word stays attached to the number. The American naval contingent in the country stood at 38,083 men in September of 1968. At the end of 1970, it stood at 16,757. Between those dates, the boats went across, the commands came off the list, and the men were flown out. In July of 1968, the Coastal Surveillance Force alone counted more than 5,300 Americans. 3 words run through the tallies of stopped boats, and they are not one word. A craft was detected when it was seen on the water. It was inspected when a patrol came alongside and looked her over. It was boarded when men stepped across and checked papers and cargo. The counts always came in that order, in 3 columns, and the columns were never equal. Between the 1st of January, 1967, and the 31st of March, 1968, the coastal forces detected 1,069,000 junks and steel-hulled craft. Of those, 415,000 were inspected from alongside. 253,000 were boarded. 15 months, 1 set of forces, and 3 columns that were filled in every day of it. Numbers of that size do not describe an event. They describe a procedure repeated until it was the ordinary shape of a working day. See the boat, close on it, come alongside, look. Sometimes step across, check the papers, cast off, go on to the next one. What was written down at the end of a month was not a story. It was how many times the same thing had been done. The cutter squadron kept its own books, and its books ran longer. From the 27th of May, 1965, to the 15th of August, 1970, it detected 838,000 craft, inspected 283,000 of them, and boarded 236,000. Around 8,000 Coast Guardsmen passed through this war altogether, on the cutters and on the larger ships offshore. Distance was counted too. That same squadron of cutters ran 4,215,000 miles in 5 years and 3 months, up and down one strip of coast. One squadron, one coastline. That figure and no wider one. The ocean-going ships standing further out ran 1,292,000 miles in 4 years and 10 months, and spent 62 6/10 of that time at sea. Inland, the counting was done by weight. By the 1st of April, 1970, the barrier operation on the 2 rivers west of Saigon, the one called Giant Slingshot, had taken 142 9/10 tons of ammunition out of caches along the banks. On the barrier that ran along the western border, the figure was 7 caches and 11.5 tons. That operation on the 2 rivers kept account of its own as well. American participation in it ended in May of 1970. Over the 515 days it ran, 38 American sailors were killed on it and 518 wounded. The figure belongs to that operation and to those days. There is no single figure of the same kind for the whole river and coastal war. What crossed anyway was counted where it could be. American intelligence in 1969 followed a regiment of about 1,025 men over the western border barrier. It came across 3 to 5 men at a time. That detail is the measure of the thing. Not that the water could not be crossed, but the size of the pieces a crossing had to be broken into. In 1970, by the same kind of estimate, at least 5 fresh regiments came over the barriers. The same estimate held that they arrived not fully able to fight because too little of what they needed had come across with them. Both halves of that came from the same people and the same reports. Out at sea, the line had gone tight. From July of 1967, the other side made no attempt at all to run a steel-hulled ship through the coastal barrier. That held until the beginning of 1968, when 4 attempts were made inside 2 days, and then it held again. A blockade is measured by what stops being tried, which is a hard thing to put in a column. In August of 1970, a study set out to put the barrier campaign into figures. It came back with 2 findings. A line barrier intercepts more infiltration than patrolling does, and it is in no sense impermeable. And barriers on the rivers put the side being cut into serious operational difficulty. Supply takes far longer to come through, and gathering the material a large operation needs becomes hard. A more careful sentence sits beside those 2. After the barrier operations began at the end of 1968, no large offensive came in 1969 or in 1970, and that may have been at least partly connected with what the barriers were doing to supply. Another assessment of the same campaign held that the crossing of supplies was badly obstructed and never at any point shut off. Then the history that gathered the figures says plainly what they do not show. They do not show what it cost the other side to look for ways around. They do not measure how many men and how much cargo actually came through. Those numbers, if they can be had at all, exist only on the other side of the war, where nobody on this side could count them. The same history grants that measuring what a barrier achieved is difficult to do in numbers at all, and that the figures it has assembled are partial evidence at best. That is not a retreat from the count. It is the count describing its own edges, in the same flat voice it used for tons of ammunition and for miles run along a coast. So the tally ends where its frames end. 1 squadron, 1 coastline, 5 years and 3 months, 1 operation, 515 days, 15 months of boardings on the sea approaches, and a weight of ammunition taken off 2 riverbanks by 1 date. Each of those is true inside its own edges and says nothing outside them. What is left when all of it has been added up is not a total. It is a set of measured pieces. How many boats were seen? How many were looked at? How many were stepped aboard? How far the cutters ran? How much came out of the caches? How long the whole of it went on? The columns close on dates. The water they were kept about does not appear in them at all. The places went out the way the boats had, one at a time, on a schedule set somewhere else. Sea float was disestablished in September of 1970, and the record is careful about why. It was not closed because of anything the enemy did. It was closed because the base ashore was finally ready to take the supply work onto itself. The pontoons that had been chained together in the middle of a river at the bottom of the country were unshackled and towed away to be useful somewhere else. Solid Anchor, the base ashore, was handed to the Vietnamese Navy in April of 1971. That spring, the supply bases began to go as well. Cot Lo went, and An Toi, then Ben Look and Rock Soi. Dong Tom, the ground that had been pumped up out of the river bottom onto a rice field that had taken dredges months to make, went in the autumn of 71. The last large group followed in April of the next year. Nha Bay, Bin Thuy, Cam Ran, Da Nang, Advisors stayed on after that, in smaller and smaller numbers. And then they went too. The hulls did not stop. The 82-foot cutters that had run the inner barrier and the Vietnamese sailors who had been trained aboard them became the core of the Navy that took the work over. A boat that had been built for one flag went on doing the same job under another, in the same water, along the same banks, at the same speed, and there was no moment at which the work itself changed. What the Americans had been moving through was older than any of it. The rivers had been there since the Mekong began building the plain, and the canals had been cut into that plain across a very long time by the people who lived on it. By 1960, of about 1,500 canals that had been surveyed, nearly half needed work before they could carry anything at all, and many of those could only be used at high water. That was the state of the place before anyone came to fight a war across it. That is the ordinary condition of the place. And it has nothing to do with the war. A canal silts, a bank slumps into the channel, a bridge sits low over the water, and a boat can pass under it only during short intervals, twice in every 24 hours. Because that is when the water is low enough to let it through and high enough to float it. Nobody arranged this. It was arranged by the river, and the river has been at it for a long time. Somewhere in that plain there is a stretch of brown water, perhaps 40 meters across, with nipa palms standing half submerged along both edges, and a fisherman's stakes driven into the mud in a line. For 5 years a boat came up that stretch on a patrol schedule and turned around at a fixed point and came back down it. Men aboard her learned the bends by the shape of the trees. They learned which cut was passable and at what hour, and they wrote it down, and the men who relieved them read it and learned it again. None of that is visible now. There is nothing on that water to show where a patrol area began or ended. No line on the bank, no marker in the channel, nothing a surveyor could find and record. A river does not hold a position. It only carries what is put on it, and it puts nothing back. The bends are where they were. The trees along them are not the same trees. What the men who worked there did was keep certain routes open and try to close certain others. And both halves of that had to be done again the next day and the day after. It was never finished, because that kind of work cannot be finished. It could only be continued or stopped. In the end it was stopped and handed over, and the route stayed exactly as open or as closed as they had been the week before. The sea still comes up out of the south and pushes into the mouths of the Mekong, and the current in 10,000 channels slows and stands and turns around and runs back inland the way it came. It does that twice between one sunrise and the next. It did it while the boats were there. It did it before them, and it does it now, and it has never once been asked, "Sleep well,